The phone rang while I was washing Caroline's coffee mug, the blue ceramic one with the small chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away for 23 years. "It gives it character," she used to say, running her thumb over the rough edge like it was a treasured heirloom instead of damaged porcelain. Now, 3 years after her funeral, I still washed that mug every morning, still dried it with the same careful attention she'd insisted upon. The caller ID showed Michael's name, my son. We hadn't spoken in 6 weeks, not since that stilted conversation about whether I was managing okay in the house, a question that felt more like an inventory check than genuine concern. I dried my hands on the dish towel Caroline had embroidered with sunflowers and picked up on the 4th ring. "Dad?" His voice carried that particular tone he'd developed since Caroline's passing, the one that managed to sound both dutiful and impatient at the same time. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Michael." I set the mug in its usual spot on the dish rack, handle turned just so. "How's Jennifer? The kids?" "Everyone's good. Listen, Dad, Jennifer and I were thinking, why don't you come for dinner this Sunday? It's been too long since we've all sat down together." The invitation surprised me. Family dinners had become increasingly rare since Caroline died, replaced by brief phone calls and the occasional awkward coffee that felt more like a medical consultation than time spent with my son. But there was something in his voice, a careful quality that reminded me of how he used to sound as a boy when he'd broken something and was working up the courage to confess. "That would be nice," I said, though something in my chest tightened. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion, just family. You know how Mom always said Sunday dinners were important?" He was right. Caroline had insisted on them for years, even when Michael reached that teenage phase where sitting at a table with his parents felt like cruel and unusual punishment. She'd make her famous pot roast, set the table with her grandmother's china, and somehow coax conversation out of our surly adolescent son about school, friends, dreams that seemed to change weekly. Those dinners had continued after Michael married Jennifer, had evolved to include grandchildren who would push peas around their plates and ask if they could be excused to watch cartoons. But we hadn't had a proper Sunday dinner in over a year. "All right," I said. "What time?" 5:30. "And Dad, dress nice, would you? Jennifer's parents are coming too." The line went dead before I could ask why Harold and Margaret Walsh would be joining us. I stood in the kitchen, holding the silent phone, feeling the familiar weight of unease that had become my constant companion since Caroline's death. Everything felt slightly off-kilter now, like a picture frame hanging crooked that you notice every time you walk past, but never quite get around to straightening. I spent the rest of the week in my usual routines, mornings in the garage where I restored classic cars more for the meditative rhythm of the work than any real profit. Afternoons tending Caroline's garden, though my efforts produced more weeds than flowers. Evenings in the living room, reading in the brown leather chair that still bore the impression of my body after 40 years of use. The house felt too large and too quiet. Caroline had filled it with music, conversation, the pleasant chaos of a woman who collected ceramic roosters and insisted on making everything from scratch. Now the silence pressed against the walls like water against a dam, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional creak of settling wood. Sunday arrived gray and cold, the kind of October day that warned of winter's approach. I shaved carefully, combed my silver hair, and put on the navy suit Caroline had bought me for our 40th anniversary. The fabric still smelled faintly of her perfume, though I told myself that was impossible after 3 years. Memory has its own peculiar physics. Michael's house sat in one of those subdivisions where every home looked like a slight variation on the same theme, colonial revival with attached garages and lawns that stayed green through chemical intervention. I'd helped with the down payment 7 years ago, back when he was struggling to establish his accounting practice, and Jennifer was pregnant with their second child. It had been Caroline's idea to help, though I'd agreed without hesitation. That's what fathers did, wasn't it? Built bridges for their children to cross into better lives. Jennifer answered the door wearing a black cocktail dress that seemed too formal for a family dinner. She kissed my cheek with perfunctory warmth, her smile bright but not quite reaching her eyes. "Richard, you look wonderful. Come in, come in. Everyone's in the living room." The house smelled of roast beef and something floral, air freshener perhaps, or one of those scented candles Jennifer favored. I followed her through the foyer, noting the fresh flowers on the side table and the way the afternoon light caught the crystal glasses arranged on the dining room table. Everything looked staged, prepared for company rather than family. In the living room, I found the assembled gathering, Michael standing by the fireplace in his best suit, Harold and Margaret Walsh seated side by side on the cream-colored sofa, like dignitaries awaiting an audience. My grandchildren were notably absent. Richard. Harold rose to shake my hand, his grip firm and deliberate. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of practiced smile that came from 30 years in commercial real estate. "Good to see you. You're looking well?" Margaret offered her cheek for a kiss I didn't particularly want to give. She was Harold's perfect complement, blonde, polished, and possessed of the sort of confidence that came from never having doubted her place in the world. "Where are Emily and Jake?" I asked, settling into the chair Michael gestured toward. My grandchildren were 8 and 10, old enough to sit through a family dinner, but apparently absent from this one. "At Jennifer's sister's house," Michael said quickly. We thought this might be better as an adults-only evening. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Adults only suggested serious conversation, the kind that required careful words and steady voices. I accepted the glass of wine Jennifer offered and waited, feeling like an actor who had arrived at the theater without knowing what play he was supposed to perform in. Dinner proceeded with the choreographed precision of a ritual. Harold carved the roast, while Margaret complimented Jennifer's potatoes. Michael poured wine with the focused attention of a man performing a task of vital importance. The conversation remained safely neutral: weather, local news, the grandchildren's school activities. But beneath the pleasantries, I could feel something building. Glances passed between Jennifer and her parents. Michael checked his watch twice. There was an agenda here, carefully planned and awaiting its proper moment. That moment came with dessert. Jennifer served coffee and store-bought apple pie, while Michael cleared his throat in the particular way that had preceded difficult conversations since he was 12 years old. "Dad," he began, his voice carrying the false casualness of a man who'd rehearsed his words. "We wanted to talk to you about something important, about your future." I set down my coffee cup, the small clink against the saucer suddenly loud in the quiet room. "My future? We're worried about you," Jennifer said, leaning forward with manufactured concern. "Living alone in that big house, trying to manage everything by yourself. It's not healthy." Harold nodded gravely. "At your age, Richard, independence can become dangerous. What if something happened? What if you fell or had a medical emergency?" "I'm 71, not 91, I said evenly, "and I manage just fine." "Do you?" Margaret's voice carried the gentle condescension of a kindergarten teacher addressing a difficult child. "Michael told us about the incident with the kitchen fire last month." I looked at my son, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. The incident had been nothing more than a forgotten skillet that had produced more smoke than flame. I'd handled it myself, aired out the house, thrown away the ruined pan. I'd mentioned it to Michael only in passing during one of our infrequent phone calls, a minor anecdote I'd forgotten until this moment. "That wasn't an incident," I said. "That was a burned dinner. The point is," Michael continued, "you're dealing with things you shouldn't have to deal with anymore. The house maintenance, the yard work, the financial management. It's too much for one person." "Which is why we have a proposal," Harold said, his tone shifting into what I recognized as his professional voice. "A solution that would benefit everyone." Jennifer reached for a folder I hadn't noticed before, placed neatly beside her chair like evidence waiting to be presented. "We've found a wonderful retirement community about 20 minutes from here, independent living, but with support services available. You'd have your own apartment, but also access to meals, activities, healthcare. And the best part," Margaret added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "is that you wouldn't have to worry about maintaining that big house anymore." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a storm breaks. I could hear the grandfather clock in their hallway. Not the same model as Caroline's, but close enough to trigger memory. I thought of Sunday dinners at our table, the one I'd built from oak harvested on our property 30 years ago. I thought of Caroline's laugh echoing off the kitchen walls as she bustled between stove and counter, conducting the symphony of a meal prepared with love rather than obligation. "What happens to my house?" I asked quietly. Michael and Jennifer exchanged a look so quick I almost missed it. "Well," Michael said, That's something we'd need to discuss. The equity could help pay for your care, of course, and the property would need proper management. Management? I repeated. The housing market is very strong right now, Harold interjected. Properties like yours, lakefront, well-maintained, they're in high demand. You could get top dollar. You want me to sell my house. We want you to be practical, Jennifer said, her voice taking on an edge. You're sitting on a small fortune in real estate while living like a hermit in a house that's way too big for one person. I thought of the workshop where I had taught Michael to use tools, the dock where Caroline and I had watched countless sunsets, the bedroom where we'd planned our retirement years together. I thought of the garden where her ashes were scattered, the rooms that still held the echo of her laughter. That house, I said slowly, is where I lived with your mother for 43 years, where you grew up, where your children learned to fish and swim and climb trees. Dad, Michael's voice softened into the tone he might use with a confused elderly relative. Mom's gone. She's been gone for 3 years. Holding on to that house isn't bringing her back. The words hit like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel. Michael wasn't cruel, just practical to a fault. But because they revealed how little he understood about love, loss, and the way memory takes root in the places we've shared with those we've lost. Besides, Margaret added with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never lost anything that couldn't be replaced, it's not like you're making good use of the space. When's the last time you entertained? When's the last time you had company besides us? I could have told them about the mornings I spent in Caroline's garden, talking to her as if she were still there to listen. I could have described the evenings I sat in our chair, not mine, reading the books she'd loved, feeling her presence in the familiar weight of the cushions. I could have explained that the house wasn't just a building, but a repository of everything we'd built together, everything that remained of a marriage that had been the best part of my life. Instead, I stood up. I appreciate your concern, I said, though appreciation was the furthest thing from what I felt. But I'm not ready to make any changes right now. Dad, please! Michael stood too, his face flushed with the particular frustration of a man who'd expected easy agreement. Just look at the brochures. Consider the possibilities. The answer is no. Harold cleared his throat. Richard, I hope you'll forgive me for speaking plainly, but this isn't really a decision you can postpone indefinitely. Properties require maintenance, finances need management, and at my age, I interrupted. I'm old enough to make my own decisions about my own life. Are you? Jennifer's mask of concern slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. Because from where we sit, it looks like you're making decisions based on emotion rather than logic, and that's dangerous for everyone involved. The room fell silent except for the tick of that clock, marking seconds that felt like hours. I looked at each of their faces in turn, Michael's stubborn righteousness, Jennifer's calculated concern, Harold and Margaret's professional assessment of a problem to be solved. None of them saw me as a man capable of living his own life. They saw an asset to be managed, a responsibility to be discharged, an inconvenience wrapped in familial obligation. I think, I said carefully, this conversation is over. I walked to the foyer and collected my coat from the closet, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who refused to be hurried. Behind me, I could hear urgent whispers, the sound of people scrambling to salvage a plan that hadn't gone according to script. Michael followed me to the door. Dad, wait, we're not trying to hurt you, we're trying to help. I turned to face my son, this man I'd raised from infancy, taught to drive, walked down the aisle at his wedding. Michael, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. If you wanted to help me, you'd help me live the life I choose, not the life you think I should live. His jaw tightened. And what if the life you choose becomes dangerous? What if something happens to you out there alone? Then that's my choice to make. I opened the door and stepped into the cool October evening. Behind me, I heard Michael call my name, but I didn't turn back. Some conversations, once they've been had, can't be unhad. Some lines, once they've been crossed, change the landscape permanently. The drive home took 15 minutes, but it felt like crossing a continent. When I pulled into my driveway and saw my house, our house, waiting in the darkness, its windows glowing with the warm light I'd left burning in the kitchen, something inside me shifted. Not broken exactly, but fundamentally altered. I sat in the car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and realized that my son hadn't just suggested I sell my house. He'd suggested I abandon everything that remained of the life Caroline and I had built together. He'd reduced 43 years of marriage to a real estate transaction, and my independence to a problem requiring professional management. And somewhere in the space between his words and my understanding, I'd stopped being his father and become his burden. Inside, I poured myself a whiskey, the good stuff Caroline had bought for special occasions, and sat in our chair, looking at the photographs arranged on the mantel. Our wedding day, Michael's high school graduation, family vacations when he still thought his parents might actually know something worth knowing. The house creaked around me, settling into its nighttime silence. But for the first time in 3 years, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt like possibility. Because if my son thought I was too old and too foolish to make my own decisions, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. If you find the story interesting, comment number 1. If you find it sad, comment number 2. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the darkness of the living room, whiskey glass empty in my hand, watching the grandfather clock mark the hours until dawn. The house spoke to me in its familiar language, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the soft protest of floorboards adjusting to the cooling air, the distant hum of the refrigerator Caroline had insisted we replace just 2 years before her diagnosis. Each sound was a memory. The creak on the third stair that had warned us when teenage Michael tried to sneak out after curfew. The rattle of the bathroom door that never quite latched properly, no matter how many times I'd adjusted the hardware. The peculiar whistle the kitchen window made when the wind came from the northeast. A sound that had driven Caroline to distraction until she'd learned to hear it as the house's way of predicting weather. These weren't the sounds of a burden. They were the sounds of home. By morning, I'd made a decision that felt as solid as the oak beams I'd helped install in the attic 40 years ago. I wouldn't be managed, I wouldn't be relocated for my own good, and I sure as hell wouldn't be convinced that my life needed to be reorganized by people who saw my independence as inconvenience and my grief as irrationality. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. I made coffee using Caroline's French press, a wedding gift from her sister that had outlasted most of our other appliances, and carried the mug to my workshop. The garage had been my sanctuary for decades, a place where problems had tangible solutions, and where the only noise was the purposeful sound of tools meeting wood or metal. Caroline had always joked that I loved that garage more than any room in the house, which wasn't entirely untrue. It was the one space that remained purely mine, unchanged by her decorating impulses or domestic improvements. The workbench held my current project, a 1967 Mustang convertible that had been rusting in old Mrs. Patterson's barn until her estate sale last spring. I'd bought it for the price of scrap metal and spent the summer coaxing it back to life, one component at a time. The work required patience, precision, and the kind of methodical thinking that had served me well during my 40 years as a civil engineer. I pulled out a legal pad and began making lists. Not the kind of lists Caroline used to make for grocery shopping or Christmas gifts, but the kind I'd once used for construction projects. Systematic inventories of assets, liabilities, and potential problems. Assets. The house, paid off 30 years ago. The 2-acre lot with 300 feet of prime lakefront. The workshop and its contents. My pension and Social Security. The modest investment portfolio Caroline and I had built over 4 decades of careful saving. The life insurance money I'd barely touched since her death. Liabilities. None, really. I lived simply, spent little, and had no debts beyond monthly utilities. Potential problems. That was where the list got interesting. I thought about Harold's comment regarding the strong housing market, the way he'd assessed my property with the calculating gaze of a man who saw opportunity in every conversation. I thought about Margaret's dismissive attitude toward my emotional attachment to the house, as if love could be quantified and found wanting on a balance sheet. I thought about Jennifer's carefully staged dinner, the absent grandchildren, the folder of retirement community brochures that had been prepared before they had bothered to ask my opinion. Most troubling of all, I thought about Michael's face when he'd said, "Mom's gone. She's been gone for 3 years." There had been no grief in his voice, no recognition of ongoing loss, just impatience with his father's refusal to move on according to someone else's timeline. I walked back to the house and called my lawyer. Marcus Holloway had handled our legal affairs for 25 years. Real estate transactions, wills, the occasional dispute with contractors who thought they could cut corners on an engineer's projects. He was my age, recently widowed himself, and possessed of the kind of sharp mind that had earned him a reputation for never losing cases he believed in. Richard, his voice carried the warmth of genuine friendship. How are you holding up? I've been better, Marcus. I need some advice. Legal advice. Professional or personal. Both, probably. We met that afternoon at his office downtown, a space that smelled of leather and old paper, and the kind of steady competence that came from decades of solving other people's problems. Marcus listened without interruption as I described Sunday's dinner, the retirement community brochures, Harold's assessment of my property's market value. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, a gesture I'd seen him make before delivering particularly pointed observations. Let me ask you something, Richard. Do you have any reason to believe your son might attempt to have you declared incompetent? The question hit like cold water. Incompetent? It's more common than you might think, especially when there's significant property involved. Adult children who believe their parents are making poor decisions sometimes petition the court for guardianship. It's difficult to prove, but not impossible if they can present evidence of diminished capacity. I thought about Michael's careful documentation of minor incidents, the kitchen fire, my occasional forgetfulness about appointments, the fact that I sometimes talked to Caroline's photograph as if she could hear me. None of those things indicated incompetence, but in the right context, presented by the right lawyer, they might suggest a pattern of declining judgment. What would I need to do to protect myself? Marcus opened a file drawer and pulled out several forms. First, we update your estate planning documents. Make sure everything is ironclad and clearly states your wishes regarding medical decisions, financial management, and property disposition. Second, we create some legal barriers that would make it very difficult for anyone to challenge your competence or take control of your affairs. What kind of barriers? Trusts primarily? We put your major assets into structures that protect them from outside interference while preserving your complete control during your lifetime. It's like building a legal moat around your castle. I signed the preliminary paperwork that afternoon and left Marcus's office with a new understanding of the battlefield I was standing on. This wasn't just about where I lived or how I spent my remaining years. This was about whether I had the right to make those decisions at all. That evening, I called my daughter Sarah in Portland. She was 2 years younger than Michael, a pediatric nurse with 3 teenagers of her own, and the kind of practical wisdom that reminded me powerfully of her mother. We'd stayed closer since Caroline's death, perhaps because grief had taught us both the value of connection over convenience. "Dad," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "This is a nice surprise. How are you doing?" "I'm well, sweetheart. I wanted to ask you something. Has Michael said anything to you about my living situation?" A pause. "He mentioned he was worried about you being alone in the house. Why?" I described Sunday's dinner without editorial comment, letting the facts speak for themselves. Sarah listened in the same focused way she'd probably learned to listen to worried parents in her emergency room, absorbing information without rushing to judgment. "Jesus, Dad," she said when I finished. "They ambushed you." That's one way to put it. And Jennifer's parents were there. Why would they need to be involved in a family discussion unless... She trailed off, and I could almost hear her mind working through the implications. Unless what? Unless they have some kind of financial interest in the outcome. Her voice had gone hard. "Dad, I need to tell you something. Last month, Jennifer called me asking questions about your finances. She wanted to know if you'd ever mentioned updating your will, if you talked about what would happen to the lake house after you're gone. What did you tell her?" I told her it was none of her business and hung up. But now I'm wondering if I should have warned you. I thought about Harold's confident assessment of my property value, his knowledge of current market conditions for lakefront real estate. "It's all right, Sarah. You couldn't have known what they were planning." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make sure they understand that I'm not as helpless as they think I am." We talked for another hour, and for the first time since Caroline's death, I felt like I wasn't facing the world alone. Sarah promised to fly out for Thanksgiving, bringing her family with her. She also promised to keep our conversation confidential, understanding instinctively that knowledge was power and power was something I needed to keep in my own hands for now. After we hung up, I poured another whiskey and sat on the back deck, looking out over the lake. The water was still as glass, reflecting the early stars and the half-moon rising over the pine trees on the far shore. Caroline and I had spent countless evenings here, planning our retirement, dreaming about grandchildren who would learn to swim in this water and build tree houses in these woods. Those dreams had been partially realized. Michael's children had learned to swim here, had caught their first fish from the dock, had roasted marshmallows around the fire pit I'd built near the water's edge. But somewhere along the way, those experiences had stopped being precious memories and started being inconvenient complications in their parents' long-term planning. I thought about Caroline's last weeks, when she'd made me promise to keep the house. "It's not just our home," she'd whispered from her hospital bed. "It's our story. Don't let anyone convince you that stories don't matter." At the time, I'd thought she was talking about sentiment, about the emotional value of familiar spaces and shared memories. Now, I understood she'd been talking about something more fundamental. The right to live your own life according to your own values, even when those values couldn't be quantified on a real estate appraisal or a retirement community balance sheet. My phone buzzed with a text message from Michael. "Dad, I hope you'll think about what we discussed. We love you and want what's best for you." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then deleted the message without responding. Love, I'd learned, could be expressed in many ways, through respect for another person's choices, through trust in their judgment, through acceptance of their priorities even when you didn't share them. What I'd experienced at Sunday dinner hadn't been love. It had been management disguised as concern, control presented as care. I walked back inside and stood before Caroline's photograph on the mantel. In the picture, she was laughing at something I'd said during our anniversary dinner 3 years before her diagnosis, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that comes from a life fully lived with someone you trust completely. "They think I'm just a stubborn old man," I told her image. "They think I'm holding on to the past because I can't handle the future." The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, our sounds, the acoustic signature of a life built deliberately and with purpose. "But they're wrong," I continued. "I'm not holding on to the past. I'm protecting our story, and I'm going to make sure it ends the way we would have wanted it to." I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to our bedroom, where Caroline's reading glasses still sat on her nightstand, and her favorite sweater still hung in the closet. Tomorrow, I would begin building the legal moat Marcus had described. I would create barriers and safeguards and contingencies that would preserve not just my independence, but my right to choose how my story ended. Michael and Jennifer and the Walshes thought they were dealing with a lonely old widower whose judgment was clouded by grief and stubbornness. They had no idea they were dealing with a man who'd spent 40 years solving complex problems under pressure, who'd learned from his wife the difference between compromise and capitulation, and who'd finally realized that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to let them make your decisions for you. The grandfather clock chimed midnight as I drifted off to sleep, marking the end of one day and the beginning of something entirely new. The morning after my conversation with Sarah, I woke with the kind of clarity that comes after a storm has passed and the air has been washed clean. I'd spent 3 years moving through my days like a man walking underwater, every action requiring extra effort, every decision filtered through the fog of grief. But something had shifted in the space between Sunday's dinner and Marcus's legal advice. The fog was lifting, and I could see the landscape ahead with an engineer's precision. I made coffee and toast, carried both to Caroline's desk in the small study off the living room. She'd used this space for managing our household finances, writing letters to her sister in Michigan, and planning the elaborate Christmas celebrations that had been her specialty. The desk was cherry wood, built by a craftsman in town who died the year before Caroline. It had drawers designed for specific purposes, deep ones for hanging files, shallow ones for stationery and stamps, a locked compartment where she'd kept important documents. I opened that locked compartment now with the key I'd carried on my keychain for 40 years, but had never needed to use while she was alive. Inside were the papers that defined our life together: birth certificates, marriage license, deeds, insurance policies, investment statements. Everything organized with Caroline's characteristic attention to detail, labeled in her neat handwriting, current as of the month before her death. I spread the documents across the desk's surface like an engineer reviewing blueprints. The house deed, stamped and notarized, showing both our names with right of survivorship. The life insurance policy that had paid off our modest remaining debts and left me with more money than I'd ever need. The investment portfolio we'd built systematically over 4 decades. Nothing flashy, just solid mutual funds and blue-chip stocks that had grown steadily while we lived well below our means. But it was the will that captured my attention. Caroline had insisted we updated every few years, adding provisions for grandchildren, adjusting for changes in tax law, ensuring that our intentions would be honored regardless of how the legal landscape might shift. The current version, executed just 6 months before her diagnosis, was a model of clarity and foresight. Everything came to me upon her death, as I'd expected. But the disposition of assets upon my death told a more complex story. The house and property were to go to Michael and Sarah equally, with provisions for either to buy out the other's share if they couldn't agree on use or disposition. The financial assets were divided 3 ways: Michael, Sarah, and a substantial bequest to the regional medical center that had provided Caroline's care during her final months. It was generous without being extravagant, fair without being rigid. Caroline had crafted it with the same thoughtful attention she'd brought to everything else in our life together. But as I read through the provisions again, I realized she'd also created something else. A roadmap for exactly the kind of family conflict I was now facing. Michael's share of the inheritance was significant, enough to pay off his mortgage, fund his children's education, and provide the financial security that seemed to drive so many of his decisions. But it was also contingent on my death, which meant he had a vested interest in my mortality that I'd never fully considered before. I wasn't suggesting that my son wanted me dead. That was too dark a thought for a Tuesday morning in October. But I was beginning to understand that my continued independence represented an indefinite delay of his financial expectations, while my placement in a managed care facility would provide him with immediate access to the house and its equity. The revelation wasn't shocking so much as clarifying. Michael wasn't evil. He was practical. He saw an asset sitting unused while his own financial pressures mounted. The mortgage, the children's expenses, Jennifer's taste for the finer things in life. From his perspective, convincing me to sell the house and move to a retirement community wasn't betrayal. It was sensible resource management. The problem was that I wasn't a resource to be managed. I was a man with my own plans, my own timeline, and my own ideas about what constituted a life well lived. I gathered the documents and drove to Marcus's office. He was reviewing contracts when I arrived, his reading glasses perched on his nose, gray hair catching the morning light from his window. He'd lost his wife Helen 2 years before Caroline, and I could see in his careful attention to detail the same methodical approach to solitude that I'd been developing myself. "Richard," he said, looking up from his papers, "you're early. That's either very good news or very bad news." "Depends on your perspective," I said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "I need to make some changes to my estate planning, significant changes." He set aside his contracts and pulled out a legal pad. "What kind of changes?" "The kind that will make it impossible for anyone to pressure me into decisions I don't want to make." I explained my new understanding of the financial dynamics at play, the way my death represented a payday that my continued independence was delaying. Marcus listened with the focused attention of a man who'd seen similar family dramas play out in countless variations over his 4 decades of practice. "You want to restructure things so your assets aren't hanging over your head like a sword," he said when I finished. "Exactly. I want to remove the financial incentive for anyone to question my competence or rush my timeline. That's doable, but it requires some creative thinking. What if we establish a charitable trust for the bulk of your estate? You maintain complete control during your lifetime, but upon your death, the assets go to causes you choose rather than to heirs who might have conflicting interests." I thought about Caroline's medical center bequest, her belief that money should serve purposes larger than family convenience. What about Michael and Sarah? I don't want to disinherit them completely. We can establish specific bequests, fixed amounts that aren't tied to the value of your real estate or investment portfolio. They get something substantial, but not contingent on your living situation or the timing of your death. And the house? Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in his characteristic thinking pose. "That's where we get creative. What if we donate the house to a conservation trust or a veterans organization? You retain lifetime occupancy rights, but the property becomes protected from development or forced sale. Your family can't pressure you to move because they no longer have any financial interest in the outcome. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. By removing the house from my estate, I would remove it from Michael's calculations. By giving it a protected purpose, I would ensure that Caroline's garden and the dock where we'd watch countless sunsets would remain exactly as we'd left them, regardless of what happened to me. How long would this take to implement? 2 weeks, maybe 3. We'll need appraisals, environmental assessments, and coordination with whatever organization you choose as the beneficiary. But once it's done, it's bulletproof. I spent the afternoon researching potential beneficiaries. The local veterans organization caught my attention, a group that provided transitional housing for former service members struggling with civilian life. They operated a small facility downtown, but had been looking for space to expand their programs. A lakefront property with a main house and workshop would give them room for both residential programs and vocational training. I'd served 2 years in the Army before college. Nothing dramatic or heroic, just the ordinary service that had been expected of young men in my generation. But I remembered the difficulty of readjusting to civilian life, the sense of displacement that came from leaving a world of clear purpose and defined roles for one that seemed chaotic and uncertain. If the house was going to serve a purpose beyond my own comfort, helping other veterans find their footing seemed like a worthy cause. That evening, I called Sarah to discuss the plan. She listened with the same focused attention she'd inherited from her mother, asking questions that went straight to the heart of practical concerns. "You're sure about this, Dad? Once you donate the property, there's no going back." "I'm sure. Your mother and I talked about legacy during her last months. She didn't want the house to become a burden for you and Michael to fight over. This way, it serves a purpose that would have made her proud." "What about Michael? He's going to be furious when he finds out." "Michael will have to learn that fury doesn't entitle him to other people's property." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "You know, I'm proud of you. After Mom died, I worried that you'd just fade away. But this sounds like you're taking control of your life again." "I am, and I should have done it sooner." After we hung up, I walked through the house room by room, seeing it with new eyes. The living room where Caroline had insisted on Christmas trees tall enough to touch the ceiling. The kitchen where she'd taught Sarah to make pie crusts and tried unsuccessfully to teach Michael the difference between simmer and boil. The bedroom where we'd planned our retirement and where she'd fought her final battle with cancer. Each room held decades of memory, but I realize now that those memories weren't dependent on my continued ownership of the building that housed them. The stories we'd created here would survive, regardless of who held the deed. The love we'd shared wouldn't diminish if the space where we'd shared it served a different purpose. What mattered was ensuring that the transition happened on my terms, according to my timeline, in service of my values rather than someone else's convenience. I poured a glass of wine, a bottle of Merlot. Caroline had been saving for a special occasion that had never come, and sat on the back deck watching the sun set over the lake. The water reflected the orange and pink sky like a mirror, and somewhere across the lake, a loon called with its wild, mournful voice. My phone buzzed with another text from Michael. "Dad, we should talk soon. The retirement community has a waiting list, and I don't want you to miss this opportunity." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed my response. "I'll call you when I'm ready to talk." His reply came within minutes. "Ready about what, Dad? We're trying to help you." I turned off the phone without responding. Help, like love, could be expressed in many ways. Real help respected the person being helped. Real help asked what was needed rather than assuming what was best. Real help preserved dignity, even when it complicated convenience. What Michael was offering wasn't help, it was management. And I was done being managed by people who confused their financial interests with my best interests. The last light faded from the sky, and the lake became a dark mirror reflecting stars I could barely see through the autumn haze. Inside the house, the grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another day in what was becoming a careful campaign for my own independence. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of making my decisions irreversible. I would create legal structures that would protect my choices from outside interference and ensure that my remaining years would be lived according to my own design rather than someone else's timeline. Michael thought he was dealing with a stubborn old man who needed to be convinced or coerced into sensible decisions. He had no idea he was dealing with an engineer who'd spent his career building things that lasted, who understood the difference between force and pressure, and who was finally ready to design the final phase of his life with the same careful attention he'd once brought to bridges and buildings. The campaign was about to begin, and I intended to win it. The papers Marcus prepared were elegant in their precision. 23 pages of legal language that transformed 40 years of careful accumulation into something untouchable, protected by law from the kind of family intervention I'd witnessed at Sunday dinner. I signed them on a Thursday morning in October, using the same Mont Blanc pen Caroline had given me for our 25th anniversary. The house, workshop, and 2 acres of lakefront property were now owned by the Northern Veterans Transition Foundation, with an irrevocable life estate that guaranteed my right to live there until my death. The investment portfolio was restructured into a charitable remainder trust that would provide me with steady income while ultimately benefiting the regional medical center where Caroline had received her care. Michael and Sarah would each receive $75,000 in cash from my life insurance, enough to be meaningful, not enough to be controlling. "Your son is going to be very unhappy," Marcus observed, as we watched his secretary notarize the final documents. "My son has been making assumptions about other people's property," I replied. "It's time he learned the difference between expectation and entitlement." But I wasn't ready for Michael to learn that lesson yet. First, I needed to prepare for his reaction, which I suspected would be volcanic once he understood what I'd done. Marcus had warned me that family members sometimes contested charitable donations, claiming undue influence or diminished capacity. The legal protections we'd built were strong, but not absolute. I needed insurance against the possibility that grief might be reinterpreted as incompetence, that independence might be redefined as irrationality. I called Dr. Patricia Williams, who'd been my physician for 15 years and had seen me through Caroline's illness and my own adjustment to widowhood. I explained the situation without mentioning names or specifics, simply noting that I was making significant financial decisions and wanted medical documentation of my mental competency. "Richard," she said, after conducting a thorough examination and cognitive assessment, "your mind is as sharp as it was 10 years ago. Anyone who suggests otherwise is either misinformed or motivated by something other than your well-being." She provided a written statement to that effect, along with documentation of my excellent physical health and detailed notes about my emotional adjustment since Caroline's death. The assessment would go into my safe deposit box alongside copies of all the legal documents, creating a paper trail that would be difficult to challenge. Next, I called my financial advisor, Tom Morrison, who'd been managing our investments since I'd retired from the engineering firm 8 years earlier. Tom had known both Caroline and me as clients who asked thoughtful questions and made conservative decisions. His opinion of my judgment would carry weight if anyone questioned the wisdom of my charitable donations. "Richard," he said after reviewing the restructured portfolio, "this is actually brilliant financial planning. You've secured your income for life while significantly reducing your estate tax liability. Your children will receive more this way than they would have under the previous arrangement." "More money, but less control," I noted. "Sometimes that's the same thing." The practical arrangements were falling into place, but I still had one more preparation to make. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with regarding Michael's expectations and Jennifer's influence. Knowledge, as Caroline used to say, was the foundation of all good strategy. I called my neighbor, Ed Patterson, who lived 2 houses down the lake and had become a fishing companion in the years since Caroline's death. Ed was retired from a career in banking and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from 40 years of evaluating other people's financial decisions. "Ed," I said when he answered, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Shoot! Have you ever heard Michael or Jennifer talking about my house? About what they think should happen to it?" Ed was quiet for a moment. "Richard, are you sure you want to know?" "I'm sure. Last month, when they were here for that barbecue you missed, I heard Jennifer on the phone with someone. She was talking about lakefront property values. about how much places like yours were going for. She mentioned something about waiting lists at retirement communities and how the timing was perfect for a quick sale. Did she mention me specifically? She said something about how you were being stubborn about facing reality, but that family sometimes had to make hard decisions for people who couldn't make them for themselves. The words stung not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Jennifer wasn't just concerned about my well-being. She was planning for contingencies that assume my incompetence or compliance. Thanks for being honest, I said. Richard, whatever's going on, just remember that you've got friends who know exactly how capable you are. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. That afternoon, I drove to the Veterans Foundation office downtown. The director, Maria Santos, was a woman in her 40s who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan before returning to civilian life and dedicating herself to helping other veterans make that same difficult transition. She listened as I explained my donation with the focused attention of someone accustomed to evaluating complex situations quickly. "Mr. Dalton," she said when I finished, "this is an incredible gift. The main house could provide residential space for 6 veterans, and the workshop could become a vocational training center. We've been dreaming about something like this for years." "There's one condition," I said. "I retain the right to live there for the rest of my life. The property becomes yours upon my death, but until then, it remains my home." "Of course. We wouldn't dream of displacing you. In fact, having you there as a mentor and resource would be invaluable for our residents." The idea appealed to me. I'd spent my career building things that serve practical purposes, and the thought of the house continuing to serve veterans even while I lived there felt like a natural extension of that work. It would also make it impossible for anyone to argue that I was selfishly hoarding resources while others had needs. Maria and I spent an hour discussing the practical details of the transition. The foundation would take legal ownership immediately, but the transfer of operational control would happen gradually over the next year, giving me time to adjust and the organization time to develop appropriate programs. In the meantime, the property would be protected from any family interference or pressure to sell. "There's something else," I said as we concluded our meeting. "My family doesn't know about this yet. When they find out, they may not be entirely supportive." Maria's expression didn't change. "Mr. Dalton, we work with veterans who have faced much worse opposition than disapproving family members. Your decision is legally protected and morally sound. Anyone who has a problem with it will have to take it up with our lawyers." Driving home, I felt the satisfaction that comes from completing a complex project according to specification and on schedule. The legal foundation was solid, the documentation was complete, and the beneficiaries were prepared for whatever challenges might arise. I'd built something that would serve its intended purpose regardless of outside pressure or family disapproval. But I wasn't naive about what was coming. Michael would eventually discover what I'd done, either through casual conversation or deliberate investigation. His reaction would be immediate and intense, shaped by years of assumption about his inheritance and months of planning for my relocation. Jennifer's would be even stronger, driven by the practical calculations that seemed to govern most of her decisions. The confrontation was inevitable. The only question was whether it would happen on my terms or theirs. That evening, I sat on the back deck with a glass of Caroline's good wine, watching the last light fade from the sky. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the early stars and the half-moon that hung just above the tree line. This view, this moment, this sense of belonging to a place that belonged to me, these were the things I'd been protecting, not just from Michael's expectations, but from the broader assumption that independence was somehow selfish when it inconvenienced other people's plans. My phone rang around 9 o'clock. Michael. "Dad?" His voice carried the strained patience of a man who'd been discussing difficult topics with his wife. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation from Sunday. Have you had a chance to look at those brochures?" "I've looked at them. And I've made my decision." "Which is?" I could have told him then. Could have explained about the Veterans Foundation, the legal protections, the careful restructuring of assets that made his assumptions about my property irrelevant. But something held me back. Not cruelty, but strategy. The foundation needed time to complete their assessments and prepare their programs. I needed time to ensure that all the legal protections were fully in place. "I'm not moving, Michael." "Dad, we've talked about this. You can't just dig in your heels and refuse to consider alternatives. I'm not refusing to consider alternatives. I'm refusing to accept other people's alternatives for my life. That's not... He stopped, and I could hear Jennifer's voice in the background, urgent and insistent. Dad, we need to talk about this face to face, soon. We will talk, when I'm ready. When you're ready? His voice rose slightly. Dad, this isn't just about you. This affects the whole family. How does my living in my own house affect the whole family? Another pause, longer this time. Because we care about you. Because we worry about what might happen if you're out there alone and something goes wrong. And because you've been planning what to do with the house after I'm gone. Silence. Then, that's not fair. Isn't it true? Dad, every family plans for the future. That's what responsible people do. Responsible people plan for their own futures, Michael. They don't plan other people's futures without consulting them. I hung up before he could respond, feeling the strange liberation that comes from speaking truths that have been carefully avoided. The conversation had confirmed what I'd suspected. Michael wasn't just concerned about my safety or well-being. He was protecting investments, emotional and financial, that he'd made in my eventual decline. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times as I locked up the house and set the security system I'd had installed the week before. Tomorrow, I would call Maria Santos and accelerate our timeline. The sooner the Veterans Foundation took legal control of the property, the sooner I could stop worrying about pressure from family members who confused their convenience with my necessity. In the bedroom, I looked at Caroline's photograph on the nightstand. She was smiling in that picture, taken during our last vacation together to the mountains of North Carolina. We'd been planning our retirement then, dreaming about the years we'd spend together in this house, watching grandchildren grow up and seasons change. They think I'm being stubborn, I told her image. They think I should be practical and accept their help gracefully. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the soft tick of the clock, the distant call of a loon across the dark water. But you'd understand, I continued. You'd know that this isn't about stubbornness. It's about finishing what we started together, on our own terms. I turned off the light and lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the lake and thinking about the conversations that were coming. Michael would escalate. Jennifer would strategize. The Walsh family would offer advice and expertise and the kind of professional concern that felt indistinguishable from professional interference. But they would all be strategizing around assumptions that were no longer valid, planning for contingencies that were no longer possible. The house was safe. My independence was protected. My remaining years would be lived according to my own design, rather than their timeline. The foundation was complete. Now came the more interesting work of building something new on top of it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in November, just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee and watching the first snow of the season dust the lake with white. Michael's voice carried an edge I hadn't heard since his teenage years, when he'd discovered that charm and negotiation wouldn't always get him what he wanted. Dad, we need to talk, today. Good morning to you too, Michael. This isn't a social call. Jennifer and I are coming over this afternoon, 2 o'clock. I set down my coffee cup, noting the way he'd phrased it not as a request, but as an announcement. What's the occasion? You know what the occasion is. But I didn't, not exactly. The Veterans Foundation had completed their assessment the week before, and Maria Santos had mentioned that they'd need to conduct a formal property survey before the transfer could be finalized. Perhaps Michael had seen the surveyor's truck in my driveway, or maybe someone at the county courthouse had mentioned the pending ownership change. Small towns had their own information networks, and legal documents rarely stayed confidential for long. I'll be here, I said. Good. And Dad, don't make any more decisions until we've had a chance to talk. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the sound of snow tapping against the windows like tiny fingers requesting entry. The confrontation I'd been preparing for was finally at hand, and I felt the peculiar calm that comes from knowing you've done everything possible to prepare for a difficult conversation. I spent the morning reviewing the documentation Marcus had prepared, ensuring that every paper was in order and every contingency had been considered. The legal protections were ironclad, the beneficiaries were prepared, and my mental competency was thoroughly documented. Whatever Michael and Jennifer had planned for this afternoon, they would discover that their window of opportunity had already closed. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard tires on the gravel driveway. Through the front window, I watched Michael's BMW navigate the turn near the mailbox, followed by a second car I didn't recognize, a silver Mercedes with Harold Walsh behind the wheel. So, this wasn't just a family intervention, it was a full strategic deployment. I opened the door before they could knock, stepping back to let them enter without invitation or welcome. Michael came first, his face set in the expression of grim determination I remembered from his childhood, when he'd decided that persistence could overcome any obstacle. Jennifer followed, dressed as if for a business meeting, rather than a family conversation. Harold and Margaret Walsh brought up the rear, their presence transforming my living room into something that felt more like a conference room than a home. "Dad," Michael began without preamble, "we know what you've been planning. Do you? The Veterans Foundation, the property transfer, the whole elaborate scheme to cut your family out of decisions about your own welfare." I settled into my reading chair, the one Caroline had recovered 3 years before her diagnosis in a fabric she'd chosen because it reminded her of spring mornings. I wouldn't call it elaborate, and I certainly wouldn't call it a scheme. Harold stepped forward, assuming the role of spokesman with the confidence of a man accustomed to difficult negotiations. "Richard, we understand you're trying to maintain your independence. That's admirable, but you're going about it in a way that could have serious consequences for everyone involved." "What kind of consequences?" "Legal consequences," Harold said. "Financial consequences. Family consequences." Margaret opened her purse and withdrew a folder, thick with documents. "We've consulted with an attorney. There are grounds to challenge this donation on the basis of undue influence or diminished capacity." "Diminished capacity," I repeated, tasting the words. "Interesting phrase." "Dad," Jennifer's voice carried the kind of calculated sympathy I'd learned to distrust. "No one wants to go down that road, but you're forcing our hand. You can't just give away the family home without consulting the family." "It's not the family home," I said quietly. "It's my home, Caroline's and mine, and we can do whatever we choose with our property." "Mom's dead," Michael said, his voice harder than I'd heard it since Caroline's funeral. "This isn't about what you and Mom wanted. This is about what makes sense now, in the real world, with real responsibilities and real consequences." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised from infancy, taught to tie his shoes and drive a car and balance a checkbook. Somewhere along the way, he'd learned to speak about his mother's death as if it were simply a fact to be processed rather than a loss to be honored. Somewhere along the way, he'd started measuring love in terms of financial convenience and family loyalty in terms of strategic advantage. "Tell me something, Michael," I said. "When you and Jennifer discuss my future, do you ever talk about what I might want? Or do you only talk about what would be easiest for everyone else?" "That's not fair. Answer the question." He glanced at Jennifer, then at Harold, seeking support that came in the form of Margaret's crisp intervention. "Richard, this isn't about fairness. This is about reality. You're 71 years old, living alone in a house that's far too large for one person, making financial decisions that affect people beyond yourself. People like you. People like your son and daughter-in-law, who love you and want what's best for you." I stood and walked to the mantel, where Caroline's photograph smiled down at the assembled group. In the picture, she was holding our first grandchild, Michael's daughter Emily, then 6 months old, and blissfully unaware that she was participating in a family portrait that would outlast the family it depicted. "Caroline and I bought this house 43 years ago," I said, running my finger along the picture frame. "We planted every tree in that yard. We built the dock where Michael learned to fish and the fire pit where we roasted marshmallows with the grandchildren. We painted every room, replaced every fixture, and made 1,000 small decisions that turned a house into a home." I turned to face them. "And in all those years, in all those decisions, we never once asked permission from people who thought they knew better than we did." "This is different," Harold said. "This is about cognitive decline, about the natural progression of aging, about family responsibility." "Cognitive decline?" I walked to the desk where I'd placed Dr. Williams' assessment. "You mean this cognitive decline?" I handed him the medical evaluation, watching his expression change as he read the physician's conclusion that my mental faculties were not only intact, but exceptionally sharp for a man of my age. Jennifer's composure slipped slightly. One doctor's opinion? From a physician who's known me for 15 years and has no financial interest in the outcome of this conversation. Michael stepped forward, his face flushed with the particular frustration of a man whose careful plans were unraveling. Dad, you're being manipulated. These veterans organizations, they prey on elderly people with sob stories and guilt trips. You think you're being generous, but you're being taken advantage of. By people who want to help homeless veterans find housing and job training? By people who want your property? People like you? The question landed like a physical blow. Michael's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. In the silence that followed, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. Let me explain something to all of you, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. The property transfer is complete, legal, irrevocable. The Veterans Foundation now owns this house and these 2 acres, with a life estate that guarantees my right to live here until my death. Margaret's folders slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the coffee table. You can't do that. There are legal protections against... Against what? Against a competent adult making informed decisions about his own property? Harold recovered first, his voice taking on the cold precision of a man who'd lost one negotiation but wasn't ready to concede the war. We'll contest it. Undue influence, fraud, elder abuse. There are any number of grounds for challenging this kind of transaction. With what evidence? With testimony from the physician who documented my mental competency? With statements from the attorney who's handled my legal affairs for 25 years? With records showing that I initiated this process entirely on my own? I walked to the window overlooking the lake. The snow was falling more heavily now, coating the dock and the trees in pristine white. Or will you base your challenge on the assumption that any decision you don't approve of must be evidence of diminished capacity? Dad, Michael's voice had lost its edge, replaced by something that might have been desperation. Please, we can work this out. We can find a compromise that works for everyone. What kind of compromise? Keep the house, but let us help you manage it. Let us handle the maintenance, the finances, the decisions that are getting too complicated for what? For me? He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The assumption was clear in his silence. I was too old, too grief-stricken, too set in my ways to be trusted with decisions about my own life. Jennifer tried a different approach, her voice softening into the tone she probably used with difficult clients. Richard, we understand that you miss Caroline. We understand that this house represents your life together, but holding on to the past isn't healthy. It's not what she would have wanted for you. What Caroline would have wanted, I said slowly, was for me to live the rest of my life with dignity, making my own choices, surrounded by the memories we created together. She would have wanted me to help people who needed help, to use what we built for something meaningful. She would have wanted you to consider your family, Margaret said. I have considered my family. I've provided for Michael and Sarah in ways that are generous without being controlling. They will each receive substantial bequests that will make meaningful differences in their lives. How much? Jennifer asked, her mask of concern slipping to reveal the calculator behind it. Enough, but not contingent on my death, not dependent on my incompetence, and not subject to revision based on your opinions about my living arrangements. The room fell silent except for the sound of snow against glass and the steady tick of time passing. I looked at each of their faces in turn, Michael's frustrated disbelief, Jennifer's barely concealed anger, Harold and Margaret's professional assessment of a deal gone irreversibly wrong. I think, I said finally, this conversation is over. Harold gathered the scattered papers from the coffee table with sharp, efficient movements. This isn't over, Richard. We'll be consulting with our attorney about options for protecting your interests. Protecting my interests or protecting your expectations? He didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. They filed out without further conversation, Michael pausing at the door as if he might say something that would bridge the gap between us. But whatever words he was searching for remained unspoken, and the door closed behind them with the finality of a judgment rendered. I stood at the window, watching their cars disappear down the snow-covered driveway, feeling the strange lightness that comes after a long-held breath is finally released. The confrontation was over, the lines were drawn, and the legal protections I'd built would hold against whatever challenges they might mount. But as I watched the taillights fade into the growing storm, I realized that something else had ended as well. The relationship I'd maintained with my son for 71 years, the careful balance of love and respect and mutual consideration that had survived his adolescence, his marriage, and even Caroline's death, had finally collapsed under the weight of competing visions about what family meant and what love required. The snow continued to fall, covering the tracks their cars had left in the gravel, erasing the evidence of their visit as efficiently as legal documents had erased their claims on my property. By morning, the driveway would be clean and white, ready for whatever came next. I poured myself a glass of Caroline's wine and sat in our chair, watching the storm transform the familiar landscape into something new and pristine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, lawyers' letters perhaps, or attempts at family mediation that would assume compromise was possible between irreconcilable positions. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in the house Caroline and I had chosen together, protected by decisions we'd both have supported, free to live the remainder of my life according to our shared values rather than other people's convenience. The grandfather clock chimed 5 times, marking the end of a day that had changed everything and nothing. Outside, the snow fell steadily, and inside, the house settled around me with its familiar sounds of home. The lawyer's letter arrived on a Thursday, delivered by certified mail with the kind of official gravity that was meant to intimidate rather than inform. I signed for it at the door, noting the return address of a law firm in the state capital, not the local practice Herald usually employed, but something bigger and more aggressive, chosen specifically to suggest that serious people with serious resources were taking this matter seriously. I read it over coffee in Caroline's kitchen, setting the pages on the table beside her blue ceramic mug, like exhibits in a case I was building against my own family. The language was everything I'd expected. Formal expressions of concern for my welfare, veiled accusations of diminished capacity, threats of legal action to protect my interests from my own poor judgment. The irony wasn't lost on me. People who wanted to control my property were claiming they needed to protect me from people who wanted to control my property. Marcus arrived within an hour of my phone call, carrying his own briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who'd been looking forward to this particular fight for several weeks. He read the letter with the focused attention of a surgeon examining x-rays, making notes in the margins and occasionally shaking his head. "Standard intimidation tactics," he said when he finished. "They're fishing for weakness, hoping you'll panic and agree to mediation or compromise. Will they actually file suit? They might, but Richard, this letter is evidence of exactly what we've been protecting you against. They're not questioning your decision because they think it's wrong for you. They're questioning it because it's wrong for them." He pulled out his own legal pad and began drafting a response. "We're going to make this very simple. Your decision was made with full legal capacity, documented by medical professionals, and executed according to proper procedures. Any challenge will be met with a countersuit for harassment and elder abuse." Elder abuse? Using legal pressure to force an elderly person into decisions that benefit the pressuring party rather than the elderly person. It's exactly what they're doing, and judges take a very dim view of it. The response letter was 3 pages of polite legal language that amounted to a professional version of "go to hell." Marcus had it delivered the same day, ensuring that Michael's lawyers would understand they were dealing with someone who was prepared for this fight and confident about the outcome. But the real victory came in smaller, quieter moments over the weeks that followed. Maria Santos called to report that the first group of veterans would be moving into the house after the new year. 3 men and 1 woman, all struggling with the transition from military to civilian life, all needing the kind of structured support that a lakefront property with workshop facilities could provide. "We'd like you to meet them," she said. "If you're comfortable with that, your presence could be tremendously helpful, a stable, positive influence during their adjustment period." I agreed, and the following week found myself sitting around my kitchen table with 4 people who understood something about serving purposes larger than personal comfort. James, a former Marine who'd done 3 tours in Iraq and was learning to navigate civilian employment. Sarah, an Army medic who'd returned from Afghanistan with injuries both visible and invisible. David and Marcus, both Navy veterans who'd struggled with addiction and homelessness before finding their way to the Foundation's programs. They were respectful of my space, grateful for the opportunity, and possessed of the kind of practical wisdom that comes from learning hard lessons the hard way. Within hours, I knew that Caroline would have approved completely of these new residents. "Mr. Dalton," James said as we concluded our meeting, "we want you to know that we understand this is still your home. We're guests here, and will act accordingly." "You're not guests," I corrected. "You're family. Different kind of family than I'm used to, but family nonetheless." The contrast with my biological family was stark and intentional. These people understood that belonging came with responsibilities, that respect was earned through actions rather than demanded through blood relationships. They understood that being welcomed into someone's home was a privilege to be honored rather than a right to be exploited. The holidays passed quietly. Sarah called from Portland to say she wouldn't be making her usual Christmas visit, not because of any anger toward me, but because Michael had made it clear that family gatherings would be uncomfortable as long as our legal dispute remained unresolved. "I'm proud of what you did, Dad," she said, "but I can't be in the middle of this fight between you and Michael." I understood, though it saddened me. Families, like houses, sometimes developed structural problems that couldn't be repaired without tearing down walls that had been thought to be permanent. Christmas morning, I woke to the sound of voices in the kitchen, the veterans preparing breakfast together, sharing coffee and conversation, and the kind of easy camaraderie that comes from people who've learned to find family wherever they happen to land. I joined them for pancakes and bacon, listening to stories about military service and civilian struggles, feeling more connected to these strangers than I had to my own son in years. After breakfast, I found a message on my answering machine, Michael's voice strained and formal. "Dad, I hope you're having a good Christmas. The kids ask about you. Maybe we can work something out in the new year." I didn't call back immediately. Some conversations required preparation, and I wasn't ready to have that conversation on Christmas morning while the house filled with the laughter of people who understood that families could be chosen as well as inherited. The new year brought unexpected developments. Harold Walsh's business hit difficulties, something about a real estate deal that had gone bad, and investors who were asking uncomfortable questions. Jennifer took a part-time job to help with expenses, and Michael's calls became less frequent and more perfunctory. It was Maria Santos who provided the most interesting intelligence. "I thought you should know," she said during one of our regular check-ins, "that someone's been making inquiries about our organization, questions about our financial stability, our oversight procedures, whether we're qualified to manage property donations." "Michael, the inquiries came through a law firm, but the pattern suggests someone with a personal interest rather than professional curiosity." "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That we're a registered nonprofit with full accreditation, proper insurance, and oversight from the State Veterans Administration. That we've been managing properties for 8 years without a single complaint or violation. And that any further inquiries should be directed to our legal counsel, who specializes in defending charitable organizations against frivolous challenges." The inquiries stopped. In February, the real victory revealed itself in the form of a phone call from Jennifer, not angry or demanding, but tired in a way I recognized from my own experience with loss and disappointment. "Richard," she said, "I owe you an apology." I waited, not trusting the sudden shift in tone. "Harold's business problems. They've put things in perspective. We were so focused on what we thought was best for everyone that we forgot to consider what was best for you. And now I realized that we were being selfish. We were thinking about our own security rather than your happiness." It was, I thought, the first entirely honest thing she'd said to me since Caroline's funeral. "Where does that leave us?" "I'd like to try again. Michael would too, if you're willing. Not about the house. That's settled, and we accept that. But about being family." "What kind of family?" "The kind that respects each other's decisions. The kind that offers support without strings attached. The kind that Caroline would have wanted us to be." It wasn't a complete victory. Trust, once broken, required time and evidence to rebuild. But it was a beginning, and beginnings were what I'd been building toward all along. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the sound of renovation in the workshop. The veterans had transformed the space into a training center for automotive repair and woodworking, teaching skills that could translate into civilian employment. The rhythmic sound of hammers and sanders filled the air, where once there had been only my solitary projects. I spent my mornings working alongside them, sharing techniques I'd learned over 50 years of building and fixing things. In the afternoons, I sat on the dock Caroline and I had shared for so many years, watching the ice break up on the lake and feeling the return of purpose to days that had been empty for too long. Michael visited in April, alone this time, carrying a fishing rod instead of legal documents. We spent the afternoon on the water, talking about his children and his work and the weather, safe topics that allowed us to remember how to be comfortable in each other's company. "Dad," he said as we headed back to shore, "I want you to know that I understand now, about the house, about the veterans. It was never really about the money. What was it about? Control, I think. Fear of losing you the way we lost Mom. We thought if we could manage your circumstances, we could manage our grief. And now I realize that the best way to honor Mom's memory is to let you live the life she would have wanted for you." We cleaned the fish we'd caught and cooked them on the grill, sharing dinner with the veterans who'd become my new definition of family. As the sun set over the lake, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Caroline had always loved, I felt the kind of contentment that comes from problems solved and purposes fulfilled. Later, after Michael had driven home and the veterans had retired to their rooms, I sat in Caroline's chair with a glass of wine and looked at her photograph on the mantel. In the picture, she was laughing at something I'd said during our last vacation together, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that comes from a life lived fully and without regret. "We did good," I told her image. "Not perfect, but good." The house settled around me with its familiar sounds, but now those sounds included the quiet conversations of people building new lives, the soft footsteps of residents who'd found their way home, the distant murmur of planning and hoping and moving forward. Outside, the lake reflected the stars and the half moon that hung over the tree line like a promise. Somewhere across the water, a loon called with its wild, haunting voice, the same sound Caroline and I had listened to during countless evenings on this same dock. I raised my glass to the darkness, to endings that had become beginnings, to families that had been broken and rebuilt in new configurations, to the understanding that home wasn't just a place you owned, but a place where you belonged. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking another day in what had become not just survival, but renewal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight I was exactly where I was meant to be, surrounded by people who understood that the best victories weren't about defeating other people, but about creating something better than what had existed before. The campaign was over, the war was won, and in the quiet satisfaction of that victory, I finally understood what Caroline had meant when she'd made me promise to keep the house. She hadn't been asking me to preserve a building, but to preserve the possibility that love could take many forms, that families could be built as well as born, and that home was something you created rather than something you inherited. The snow had melted, the ice had broken up, and the lake was ready for another season of possibility. So was I. 2 years later, I woke to the sound of laughter drifting through my bedroom window. Not the forced merriment of people trying to be cheerful, but the genuine sound of friends discovering something unexpectedly funny in their shared morning routine. James and David were discussing the proper way to stack firewood, their conversation punctuated by the kind of good-natured arguing that comes from people who've learned to trust each other's competence. I dressed slowly, my joints reminding me that 73 years of living leaves its marks on the machinery, and made my way to the kitchen. The coffee was already brewing. Sarah, the former Army medic, had assumed responsibility for ensuring that caffeine was available before anyone attempted serious conversation. It was a small courtesy that made all the difference in a house shared by people who would learn to appreciate life's reliable pleasures. "Morning, Richard," she said, not looking up from the crossword puzzle she worked through each day with methodical precision. "Sleep well?" "Well enough. Any excitement I missed?" "Marcus caught his first dose of the season yesterday evening. He's been insufferable about it ever since." Through the window, I could see Marcus on the dock, rigging his fishing rod with the focused attention of a man who discovered that patience was a skill that translated well from military service to civilian pursuit. He'd been with us for 18 months now, long enough to stop flinching at unexpected sounds and to begin talking about the future in terms of possibility rather than mere survival. I poured coffee into Caroline's blue mug, a habit I'd maintained even though it no longer felt like a conversation with memory, but simply like the right way to begin each day. The mug had acquired new meaning over the years, becoming less a shrine to loss and more a symbol of continuity, of the way love persists even as its expression evolves. The kitchen table held the detritus of a household in comfortable operation. Yesterday's newspaper folded to the sports section, a shopping list written in James's precise handwriting, bills sorted into neat piles awaiting my attention. These weren't the papers of a man living alone, but of a family managing its collective responsibilities with quiet efficiency. Maria Santos had been right about the therapeutic value of purposeful living. The veterans who'd made their home here weren't just receiving help. They were providing it, creating a household that functioned better than any of us could have managed individually. I'd found myself sleeping more soundly, eating more regularly, and engaging with the world beyond the property lines in ways I hadn't since Caroline's death. The phone rang as I finished my first cup of coffee. Sarah, my daughter, not my housemate, calling from Portland as she did every Thursday morning, maintaining the connection we'd rebuilt after the legal troubles had settled into permanent resolution. "Dad, how are things at the compound?" Compound was her affectionate term for what the property had become. Not quite a commune, not exactly a boarding house, but something uniquely functional that defied easy categorization. "Peaceful," I said. "Marcus is convinced he's mastered the art of bass fishing. James finished the kitchen cabinets yesterday. You'll have to see them when you visit. And David started teaching woodworking classes at the community center. And you, how are you managing the role of house patriarch?" I considered the question. The veterans treated me with respect, but not deference, including me in decisions without deferring to my judgment, creating the kind of adult-family relationship I'd always hoped to have with Michael, but had never quite achieved. "I'm not the patriarch," I said. "I'm just the guy who happens to own the rights to live here until I die." "That's not what Maria tells me. She says you've become something of a legend in the veterans community, the man who built a better model for transitional housing." Maria exaggerates. Does she? Because I got a call last week from a documentary filmmaker who wants to do a story about innovative approaches to veteran care. Apparently, your arrangement has attracted some attention. The idea of media attention made me uncomfortable in the way that unexpected praise always did. I'd made my decisions for personal reasons, not to serve as an example of enlightened social policy. But I suppose that meaningful change often began with individual choices that proved larger principles. "I'll think about it," I said. "Good. And Dad, Michael called me yesterday." I set down my coffee mug, noting the way my chest tightened at the mention of my son's name. We'd managed a careful détente over the past 2 years, holiday cards, occasional phone calls, stilted but civil interactions when family events required our mutual presence. But the relationship remained fragile, built on mutual wariness rather than renewed trust. "How is he?" "Better, I think. The business is stable, Jennifer's found work she enjoys, and the kids are thriving. But he asked about you, not about your health or your living situation, but about whether you were happy." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth, that you seem more yourself than you've been since Mom died, that you've found a way to honor her memory while building something new." I thought about that assessment as we concluded our conversation. Was I more myself? The question assumed there was a self to return to, some essential identity that existed independent of circumstances and relationships. But perhaps the self was more fluid than that, something that evolved in response to new challenges and opportunities, rather than something fixed that could be recovered or lost. After lunch, I walked the property with the slow deliberation of a man conducting inventory. The workshop hummed with activity as David prepared materials for his evening classes at the community center. The garden Caroline had designed showed the careful attention of people who understood that beauty required maintenance, but was worth the effort. The dock extended into water that reflected the October sky like polished metal, providing the kind of view that made ordinary moments feel significant. Everything was exactly as it should be, and yet everything had changed. The house was still my home, but it had also become something larger, a demonstration that independence didn't require isolation, that solitude didn't have to mean loneliness, that families could be constructed as well as inherited. I found James in the garden, harvesting the last tomatoes before the first hard frost arrived to end the growing season. He worked with the methodical attention of someone who'd learned to find meditation in routine tasks, each movement purposeful and unhurried. "Good crop this year," I observed. Caroline's design was excellent. Good soil, proper drainage, enough sun without too much exposure to wind. She knew what she was doing. She always did. James straightened, brushing soil from his hands. "Richard, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret it? The way things worked out with your son?" I considered the question, aware that it touched on the fundamental trade-off I'd made: family peace in exchange for personal autonomy, conventional relationships in exchange for authentic ones. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that Michael couldn't find a way to respect my decisions without agreeing with them. But I don't regret the decisions themselves. Even if it means you see less of your grandchildren, that was the sharpest edge of the choice I'd made. Emily and Jake, now 10 and 12, remained largely absent from my life, except for carefully orchestrated visits that felt more like diplomatic exchanges than family gatherings. I'd miss school plays and soccer games and birthday parties, trading the role of involved grandfather for the principle of autonomous living. Even then, I said, because the alternative would have taught them that love requires surrender, that family means accepting other people's control over your life. I'd rather they remember me as the grandfather who stood his ground than the one who gave in to make things easier. James nodded with the understanding of someone who'd made similar trade-offs between principle and convenience, between individual integrity and collective comfort. That evening, we gathered around the dinner table, the same table where Caroline and I had shared 40 years of meals, now extended to accommodate a family of 5 adults who'd found each other through circumstance rather than blood. The conversation ranged across topics both mundane and profound. David's woodworking students, Sarah's progress in nursing school, Marcus's ongoing debate with himself about whether to pursue a fishing guide license. It was the kind of dinner conversation Caroline had always encouraged, people sharing their authentic concerns and genuine enthusiasms without the careful editing that formal occasions required. The difference was that these people had chosen to be here, had elected to build this particular version of family life, rather than simply accepting the arrangements that biology or circumstances had provided. After dinner, I helped with the dishes, a task that had become communal rather than individual, shared according to ability and availability rather than traditional gender roles or household hierarchy. It was a small thing, but it represented the larger principle that had made this arrangement work. Everyone contributed according to their capacity. Everyone benefited according to their needs, and no one assumed authority over anyone else's choices. As the evening progressed and the others settled into their various pursuits, David reading military history, Sarah working on nursing school assignments, James and Marcus discussing fishing techniques with the intensity of military strategists, I found myself drawn to the living room window that overlooked the lake. The water was dark now, reflecting only the lights from scattered houses around the shoreline, and the stars beginning to appear in the clear October sky. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called with its wild, mournful voice, the same sound Caroline and I had listened to during countless evenings in this same spot. I thought about the documentarian Sarah had mentioned, about the possibility that our arrangement might serve as a model for others seeking alternatives to conventional approaches to aging and family responsibility. The idea was simultaneously flattering and troubling. Flattering because it suggested we'd created something worth emulating. Troubling because it implied a level of intentionality that hadn't really existed. I hadn't set out to revolutionize anything. I'd simply refused to let other people's convenience override my own judgment, and everything else had followed from that basic principle. The veterans had found their way here, not because I'd designed a program to help them, but because the structure of protection I'd built around my own autonomy had created space for others seeking similar independence. Perhaps that was how most meaningful change happened, not through grand designs or systematic planning, but through individual choices that proved larger principles, through personal decisions that demonstrated alternative possibilities. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Michael, Dad, the kids have been asking about Thanksgiving. Would you be open to having dinner here this year? No agenda, no pressure, just family." I stared at the message for a long moment, aware that it represented a small but significant shift in the dynamic that had defined our relationship since the legal confrontation. He was asking rather than announcing, suggesting rather than demanding, acknowledging my right to choose rather than assuming my compliance. I typed my response. "I'll think about it and let you know." It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't refusal either. It was the kind of careful consideration that respect required, the acknowledgement that relationships could evolve without erasure, that forgiveness could coexist with boundaries. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another day in what had become not just survival, but genuine contentment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged. In the house Caroline and I had chosen together, surrounded by people who understood that the best families were built on respect rather than obligation, on choice rather than circumstance. I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to our bedroom, where Caroline's photograph still smiled from the nightstand, and her favorite sweater still hung in the closet. But now, these weren't shrines to loss, but reminders of continuity, symbols of the way love persisted, even as its expression evolved. "We did good," I whispered to her image, as I had countless times over the past 2 years. "Different than we planned, but good." Outside, the lake lapped gently against the dock we'd built together 30 years ago. Inside, the house settled around me with its familiar sounds of home, not the lonely sounds of a man living alone, but the comfortable sounds of a family at rest, of people who'd found their way to each other and chosen to stay. The campaign for my independence was over. The war for my autonomy had been won. And in the quiet aftermath of those victories, I'd discovered something Caroline had always known, but I'd been too busy to understand. That the best life was one lived according to your own values, surrounded by people who supported those values rather than trying to change them. The stillness after the storm wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, rich with the promise of days that would unfold according to my own design, rather than someone else's timeline. And that, I realized, was victory enough for any man. If you like the main character, type like.